This evening, we are privileged to watch and participate in a conversation between two of the most interesting and exciting figures in American music today. Augusta Read Thomas is a university professor, the university's highest distinction, and professor of composition in the Department of Music. As a composer, Augusta Thomas's oeuvre is known for its fierce and unbridled passion. Her work and her career have been championed by such luminaries as Barenboim, Boulez, Eschenbach, Salonen. She, in her turn, has been an influential teacher and mentor to students at every level through her work at the Eastman School at Northwestern University, Tanglewood Summer Program, and now, of course, at the University of Chicago. She is the former chairperson of the American Music Center. She has become one of the most recognizable and widely loved figures in American music today. Thomas was the longest-serving Mead composer in residence for Daniel Barenboim and Pierre Boulez at the Chicago Symphony with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra from 1997 through 2006, a residency that culminated in the premiere of her Astral Canticle, one of two finalists for the 2007 Pulitzer Prize in Music. Most recently, Thomas has devoted energy to organizing Ear Taxi Festival, an elaborate festival that will take place here in Chicago in October 2016, celebrating new music made in and around Chicago, including the works of 75 composers and over 300 performers. Meanwhile, here at the university, Augusta Read Thomas's vision for nurturing future generations of composers is taking shape through our new Chicago Center for Contemporary Composition, which will bring established and rising composers to our campus for intensive engagement with scholars and students from every discipline and field. She will model this engagement for us tonight in her conversation with Philip Glass. Philip Glass graduated from the University of Chicago 60 years ago at the age of 19, having majored in mathematics and philosophy. Philip Glass is without question among the most innovative and influential composers in the 20th century and 21st, and his fusions of Western and world musics are considered among the earliest and most successful global experiments of their kind. Through his operas, symphonies, his compositions for his own ensemble, and his wide-ranging collaborations with artists, including Twyla Tharp, Allen Ginsberg, Robert Wilson, David Bowie, to name only a few, Glass has been an extraordinary and unprecedented, extraordinary and unprecedented impact on the musical and intellectual life of his times. Indeed, Glass was the first composer to win a wide, multi-generational audience in the opera house, the concert hall, the dance world, and in films and popular music, and to do all of that simultaneously. The new musical style that Glass helped create was eventually dubbed minimalism, though Glass himself has said that he never liked the term, and that the most useful description is actually chamber music that is amplified. When Philip Glass was on our campus in February 1982 with his ensemble to play in Mandel Hall, he recalled then that he saw musical scores for the first time here in our library, and that he wrote his first composition in his dorm room at Burton Judson Hall. His compositions, either standing on their own or performed in conjunction with other media, move the listener to unexplored places. The operas, Einstein on the Beach and The Voyage, among many others, play throughout the world to full houses. Glass has written music for experimental theater and for Academy Award-winning motion pictures such as The Hours and Martin Scorsese's Kundun, while Koyaanisqatsi, his 1982 filmic landscape with Jeffrey Reggio and the Philip Glass Ensemble, may be the most radical and influential making of sound and vision, possibly since Disney's Fantasia. We are thrilled to have him back on our campus and have the opportunity to learn more about his interdisciplinary collaborations and his prolific history of cross-cultural projects. Please join me in welcoming Augusta Read Thomas and Philip Glass to the stage.
You are such a generous, creative, visionary artist, and I am a huge fan of you and of your work. And I loved your memoir. Just absolutely fantastic. And I thought we could start this conversation by just take us into your house. Like, the kids have gone to school, you've had your coffee, you sit at your piano. Are you happy at that moment?
Oh, you know, I think, I have to say that I was fascinated by writing music when I was young, but now I love it. I have my, I have a it's kind of like more like a drawing board, like a big table that was tilted, and the music paper's there, the pencils are there, and it's the only time where I feel that I really know what I'm doing, or that there's some kind of, well, control is a funny word, but where I feel like whatever happens there will be something that will be rewarding to me in some way. Mm. But
you work so hard. I can.
But no, that's the part that isn't hard. Mm-hmm. The hard part are the airplanes. Mm-hmm. I mean, the things that we can't have very little control of. The work part is performing. For example, I love to play, but it's getting to I can't play at home that much because no one plays at home. You have to go out. You have to go to Europe. You have to go to Asia, whatever you have to go. I have to go to Asia this year, which I try not to, but it's so far away. It's just it's a physical. Yeah. It's a physical thing. I tell you, if you're lucky enough to be traveling when you're close to 80, which I am, very close to 80, almost 80, and if you're lucky enough to get that all, then the thing that gets the hardest is the traveling. Yeah. That's the hardest part. Everything else is a pleasure, really. So when you're sitting in your studio, you're at your piano, writing at the piano and writing the notes on paper? Is that how you're mostly doing it? I use pencil and paper, I'm happy to say, because actually it's a good thing because I keep all the sketches now. Great. I number the pages so I can find them again, because one comes along and says, they'll say, well, in this piece, in this measure, what note is that? I can't read it. Is that an E flat or an E natural? Yeah, and I say, wait a second, and I can usually find it. Actually, I don't keep all the sketches there, but I have to archive it myself, and then I can't remember sometimes, and I look at it and I can usually the manuscript is usually correct. That's my assumption is the manuscript is right, and then everything else is a mistake. And that tends to be true. Yeah, exactly. Do you find that? Yes. Do you keep notes like that? Well, I really want to speak about you, but do you use what? I want to know. Do you write down the music or use a computer? I write music actually by hand on paper. Yes, of course, that's the right way to do it. With whiteout. No, the reason is for that is that your hand is also a record of what you're doing. That's right. Yeah, it's like. And the files don't show that. That's so true. Also, when you I saw a bunch of your manuscripts. They're gorgeous. You have to work on your archive. And then you have one because you have a record of what you've written. But a file is not an archive. That's right. Yeah, your handwriting's gorgeous. It's like a photograph in a way. I mean, really. We'll talk about this. I had just one last question about that. Do you feel sometimes that when you're composing that it's like therapy? You know, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a writer, and he works very hard at writing. And I said, tell me, Stokes, his name is Stokes. Stokes, why do you write? He said, well, if I don't write, I would be crazy. It keeps me sane. Exactly. And I had never put it quite that boldly, but I think that, I don't think it's just artists who do that. I think we all do that. I think, we always think of art as this sort of wonderful, different kind of, it isn't that different. It's not so different from cooking or sewing or inventing a language or designing a program. Anytime that that something, we have a way of making something different come into the world. I call it, as part of what I call dreaming. I don't mean dreaming, I mean the dreaming that you do when you're awake.
Right.
And I think that's, there's tremendous resource for us as human beings, and I see that people do that. It's not just, we always talk about the artists, they're not actually that special. They're special in a way because our skills are a little perhaps unusual, but the way that our work functions for us is the way it works. My mother was a librarian. I'm sure that there were some very similar things.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, you said that all music, without exception, is ethnic music.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that a little for us?
I would say that earlier. It happened this way for me. I began to work with people from Africa, from Asia, from South America. I did it out of curiosity because I'm very curious about how people arrive at what they do. When I ask them how they learned and how they studied, and a friend of mine, for example, Fode Suso, a kora player, that's a harp-like African instrument. He's a singer, and the history of the Mundingo tribe is in the songs. And I found out how he studied, and I went to where he lived, and what I discovered was that when I played my music in these places of India, Africa, wherever I would be, that as far as sometimes people liked it, sometimes people would say, I can't make heads or tails of it. And I realized that to them, I was ethnic music. I mean, I was not the music of their daily life. I was something exotic music that had entered in some curious way. In that sense, so my music was ethnic music.
Yeah.
Well, from that point of view, there is no music that is not ethnic music. There's no one that has a copyright on creativity or on style or on thought or on poetry. There's no copyright for that. These are spontaneous, I could say. Creations isn't quite the right word. They result from our activities. And in that sense, we carry with us the language of our culture. And anyone, I don't have to tell you, you're in Chicago, so you know that.
You know what might be interesting? If, I actually prepared a few very, very short sound samples, and I did prepare one of Fode Soso. This is from your films, The Screens.
Yeah.
This is track 2. Can we just hear just 30 seconds of this? It's absolutely gorgeous. That your study of the great books and learning how to use the library has really affected the music?
Oh, sure, absolutely. By the way, Fode lived in Chicago for about 30 years. He was from the Gambia, but he would come here. He's not here right now. For sure. Later, when I got interested in working in theater, working with stories, working with writers, I knew how to use a library. I knew how to do research. I knew how to assimilate materials from exotic. By exotic, I mean something that was not ordinary, something that I was not born close to. I think that was because I was here when I was 15, and just studying Homer, or studying
Shakespeare,
Galileo, studying anything, everything. In a way, I said all music is ethnic music, but almost all information is exotic, because it comes from us from a place of, we come from a place of ignorance. Ignorance means not knowing. We don't know. And anytime an intrusion on our ignorance becomes it's an opening, in fact, that and culture is allowed to, it comes in like water and welling up out out of the sink practically, how that can happen. And one of the things that the thing that was so about this place that was unique for me, or for many people, was that the breadth and depth of culture was far more than I could have imagined growing up in Baltimore, Maryland. Now, Baltimore wasn't a bad place. People might think that, but there was a great library system in Baltimore. The Enoch Free Library was a wonderful library.
And your mother was a librarian.
I studied astronomy when I was 10 or 12 years old at that place. But it's still, when I came to Chicago, it felt like I was walking into a living encyclopedia. And the school was like that. At the time that I came here, I had to take the courses of the college, but we were invited to go to any classes we wanted to in the university, and I would go to, all we had to do was ask permission, and the permission was always granted. So I would go to perhaps someone's house who was doing a course that wasn't even in the catalog. He was giving a talk about the Iliad, and it went on for a year.
And that was in his home, right?
What?
Isn't that what you said? That was in his home.
It was in his home.
Yeah.
It wasn't even a course.
Yeah.
And you didn't even know about it unless someone said, "Oh, are you going?"
And no exam.
Yeah. What?
Right? And no exam.
Well, I didn't take the exams anyway. I took the ones at the end of the year.
You crammed for those, though, right?
Well, of course I did. But on the other hand, I wasn't just sleeping all the time. I was very interested in. I went to.
You went to a lot of the jazz clubs, right?
I went to that too. But besides that, I went to courses on Aristotle, or I was interested in things. The thing is that if you're, I was so curious about things. I still am, I think, and there was, I did not come to the end of my curiosity. It was always something beyond which I could. Again, I didn't know the music. I knew a lot about music because my father had a small record store, but I heard music live really for the first time. Though I was too young to get into the clubs, I would go down to 55th Street to the Beehive, and I would listen through the window until finally the guy, after a number of times, the guy at the door said, "Okay, kid, come on." He said, "Okay, you sit here." And I had to sit next to him so that if someone came, he would get me out right away. So I legally couldn't be in those places, but I was there. Later, I was in New York, and I continued that at the listening to music of Ornette Coleman, and there was so much music that was good. That music I never really studied. I never played jazz, but I was totally enamored by it, and in the end, it's insinuated itself into the music. I mean, just that little bit that you played, you can. I never was an improviser, though I play with Fode, and he is an improviser, and we play together.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask, you were speaking about your teachers and about two angels, Nadia Boulanger and Ravish.
No, I said one was the angel, and one was the devil.
One was the angel. Okay. One taught with love and one taught with fear.
One taught with love and one taught with fear. So, but I felt like I was, at one point in my life, and it was maybe in 1963 or 64, it felt like I had one on my left shoulder and one on my right shoulder. And in the end, it was the same. The style of pedagogy was remarkably different. I mean, I came to Mademoiselle Boulanger's door, and for some reason, the metro delivered me a little bit late. It was better to go home, than to be late. I would go home and make a call that I was sick and couldn't make it that day. But I would never, I only showed up late once, and I never did that again. But obviously, it was a very, I can't say that. I would say that Boulanger, she did love her students, but it was a hard tutelage.
Yeah, I have an imagination that you were sitting there singing cadences and doing counterpoint exercises.
Oh, yeah. That's what you did with her. You did some of that at Fontainebleau, right?
A little bit, yeah. But I can imagine those years that you spent there.
the days began in the dark, 6, 7 in the morning in winter in Paris, it was dark, and at the end, at 6, 7 at night, it was dark again. And I would leave for my classes. I had 3 or 4 classes a week. I practically stopped. That was the first time and the last time I didn't write music for about a year. Not the first year I just stopped, and then I began to write again. Because I had so much, though I was a graduate of Juilliard, I was entitled to have had an education, and I suppose I did, but it didn't meet her standards, and I had to redo everything. We started at first species counterpoint again. Oh, can you believe that? And but we went very quickly. Still, that's what it was. She wanted a complete reformation, a formation of everything.
Yeah.
The whole thing.
Amazing. And when you left, you were relieved?
Well, I left because I couldn't bear it any longer. At that point, I was 28. I had been studying music since before I was 8 years old. It was more than 20 years.
Right, when you were young, playing flute.
Well, I started with flute. I started with the violin when I was 6. But I started with flute when I was 8. And I finished, and at the age of 28, I couldn't do it anymore. I said, and I came from my lessons in the fall. She thought I was coming to start again. I was starting my 3rd year because I had been there in the summer as well, in Fontainebleau, where you were. And she thought I was coming to start my classes again. And I no longer had any money. And she said, no, you don't need the money. You just come here. And I said, but I have no way to pay. She said, this is what she said, oh, someday you will. Now, the fact was that I never made any money for years after that. And I meant to do it, but she died before I made any honest money from music. And so she said I would pay her back, and I wonder, maybe I have in some strange way.
I think you definitely have.
Well, I always say nice things, but not always so nice. But she was a fantastic teacher. And you know what it was? This is what she did. She taught you how to listen. When you learn to listen, then you can begin to compose. And I learned that from Richard Serra, who's a sculptor, a good friend of mine, who I was his assistant for a while. And then one day I said to Richard, you know, I was moving sculpture around. You know, it's a wonderful sculptor. But he liked me because I wasn't a sculptor, and so I guess I wasn't taking any of his ideas or whatever it was. He liked to have me around. And I said, Richard, you know, I can't even draw. I wish I could draw. He said, oh, I can teach you to draw. I said, well, how would you do that? He said, well, I'll teach you to see, and then you'll be able to draw. By the way, I never did learn to draw. And I realized in that moment that drawing had to do with seeing, that dancing had to do with moving, that poetry had to do with speaking, that music had to do with hearing.
Yeah.
And when I thought about that, and I had just been from her class only a year or two after I'd seen her, and I thought about what I had accomplished with her, what she had forced me to do. I think she had to beat it out of me. She made me hear things that I couldn't hear.
Yeah. One question related, you had said that Ravi Shankar was like your father and Nadia like your mother, and I just wanted to broaden that out a little bit and ask, who are your cousins or who are your siblings?
Well, there are all kinds of people that were, I guess, who was that fellow from, there were other...
I was thinking also of like jazz and rock and roll and Beethoven.
You know, I met Virgil Thompson a number of times. On his 90th birthday was my 50th birthday, and we happened to have our birthday parties together. And he said, you had a very high voice like this. He said, no, what was it like with Nadia Boulanger? Because I studied with her. And I told him what I studied, and he said, exactly what I did. Now, 40 years earlier, he had the same lessons that I did. So I would say that he was one of my, well, certainly an uncle, certainly not a cousin. But there were all people from the jazz world, many people studied with her. She had thousands of students. I don't know that she was such a great teacher, but she taught a lot of people who became great teachers. And some of us became composers.
One other question, I've always wondered about this. Of course, she would be someone who wouldn't like parallel fifths, right? This
Yeah.
would not be a good thing.
Yes, that's why I did it.
Yeah. So on that note, if I might say, I really wanted to play an excerpt of your music in fifths.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask, was this really an homage to her? Or was it kind of like a secret sort of?
Well, it was both. First of all, I wrote a piece called Music in Fifths, and I wrote it in 1969. I started with her in 1966 was, I think, the last year I was with her. And I called it Music in Fifths. And then the next piece was called Music in Country Motion, Music in Slow Motion. Now, the point, there was another point to it. But first I was celebrating, not making fun of. I was celebrating my teaching.
I was just wondering.
Yeah. But I celebrated by doing a piece called Music in Fifths. And, but it was also a way of describing the music was actually, the process of the music was the music itself.
Exactly, the form and the content.
The form and content were identical.
Yes.
But if you understood what the title was, then you understood what the piece was.
Yeah. Let's hear just 30 seconds of it.
30 seconds is
that won't,
probably what you can take.
Yeah, it's track 3.
She said, I have such a profound respect for the creativity of music that I'm afraid if I said something of someone's composition that there would be a great talent that I had not seen and I would have
or derailed them
it.
or
So
something. Yeah.
I won't talk about your music, but we'll talk about technique. And well, she didn't teach composition, she taught technique. And when people said they studied composition with her, probably they never met her. Because she never did teach composition.
Yeah.
But the only time I showed her my music was at my first lesson with her. I brought maybe 8 or 10 pieces. I thought they were my best pieces, and I gave it to her. She could speed read. She could, like that. She could read a page of music the way you would. Doris Lessing was a speed reader, too. She could read 4 novels in a day. But she could... Mademoiselle Boulanger could just turn the page. And I came to, this was my first lesson, and she wanted to see what I'd written. And she was going through this poem, didn't say anything, and finally she stopped. And she pointed and said, this measure was composed by a real composer.
That's great. That is fantastic.
Well, that's the last nice thing she said to me. She never said that again. No.
But at the end of, I know she wrote nice references about you and whatnot.
I found out that she did, but I didn't know that at the time.
Yeah. I did want to, you have so many interesting things in your life. I want to move through some other topics. So around this time, you were writing music for several plays of Samuel Beckett. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and if you saw synergies between the non-narrative nature of Beckett and the rhythm of India.
Beckett was living in the same part of Paris that we were. We were 3 or 4 young Americans. We were in our 20s. For some reason, he liked us. And he was a man probably in his 50s at the time. And one of us was bilingual. We were, but he preferred to speak in French. And he took us on, and we asked him, I wrote music for about 8 or 9 of his plays. Mm-hmm. And I would send him the pieces, and sometimes he didn't want to meet, didn't want to see us, but we could consult him about it. I remember I did a piece called Company, and it was a monologue that was taken from one of the novels. He let us do that too. We would take pieces out of Malloy or Malone Dies and make an evening-length piece by one actor. And in this one particular piece, the director, who was the actor, asked me to write a piece of music, and I wrote to Mr. Beck, and I said, where should I put the music? And he wrote back, in the interstices of the piece, as it were, which of course told me nothing.
Right.
So I that's what I did. It looked like there was a place to put a piece of music, and I wrote pieces of music that fit in between and he seemed to be pleased with it. He never said anything. Let's put it this way. He allowed us to go on. I wrote music for Endgame, I wrote for La Comédie, for Merci à ma Camille. I wrote for about 8 pieces, and what I had to do at that time was I had to find a language of music that would somehow, now at the time it was shortly after Waiting for Godot that was a few years before, but it was very, very abstract theater. In one way, in another way, it was comic theater in another way. It was like vaudeville, really. If you listened to it in a certain way, it was hilariously funny. And that's how we did listen to it. But in a way, not so different. Years and years later, I was working with a text of Kafka. Kafka thought his texts were funny. I just did the trial. And he did it as a black comedy. It was just done. And people said, oh, it's really funny, but Kafka thought it was funny too. And we were convinced that Beckett, it was like vaudeville. But I had to find a music to fit that, and I began to work in a repetitive style, which I had learned. The elements of it came from my work with Ravi Shankar.
That's where I was just about to head.
Yeah. When I was working with Ravi Shankar, I spent a lot of time with him, but his tabla player, Alaraka, was the one that was really teaching me, because Alaraka would take the time to, and I actually studied with him. And
you went and bought tabla and...
I did all that stuff. Yeah. And so I got involved with stretches of music that were very repetitive, and I started to put it against the Beckett pieces. And in some ways it made it, the funny thing was that when you put the music with it, you both heard the words better and you heard the music better.
Interesting.
That somehow the music framed it, or the words framed the music in a way that made them both seem more enjoyable. So that became, so in a funny way, those early theater pieces were the basis of, it wasn't, I mean, it was only, I would say that was in 65, 66. Einstein on the Beach was written maybe 8 or 9 years later, very soon after that. The progress from Music and Filth to Einstein on the Beach happened in 7 or 8 years, happened very, very quickly, within a 10-year, easily within a 10-year period. And at that time, the music was changing so rapidly, every piece became, it's still changing. It's still, you should play something that doesn't sound.
No, I'm going to. I have a whole bunch of other samples which I want to get to. Let's jump now to the Philip Glass Ensemble. Okay. Skipping, we can come back to Ravi Shankar and maybe, but it's amazing. You formed your own ensemble, had this very iconic sound with the keyboards and the winds. And
I came back from Paris and I wanted to play. I wanted to find people to play. One reason I left Paris was that I was, after I finished this piece for Beckett, I began writing some chamber pieces, and I tried to get the French musicians to play, and they wouldn't play it. They say, "Ce n'est pas la musique." It's not music. Ce n'est pas la musique. I heard that. Ce n'est pas la danse. They said that about dance. It's not dance. When I did the piece with 79, I did with I listened to Charles, and we took it to the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, the same place where the Rites of Spring had been, and someone got up and said, "Ce n'est pas la danse," echoing something that had been said by 70, 80 years before. So I wanted to say, okay, I was ready to go home anyway. I stopped on my way in India, where I spent half a year, and then finally got back to New York, and I wanted to re-engage into the enterprise of a composition based on the kinds of structures that I had been working with.
Right.
And I put together a group. What I did is call my friends I went to school with. Most of them were keyboard players, so I ended up with multiple keyboards. and a couple saxophone players, and I got a singer, and that was the group. And it stayed. In fact, that group, it was.
A lot of them were with you for like 40 years, right, or 30
yeah,
years?
we're still playing.
Yeah.
I just was in. I was just in Switzerland a couple of days ago, in Geneva, and we played the music from Koenigsegg with the film. That music was written in 1978 or 79, and the audiences are the same age we were when I wrote it.
Yeah.
You know, that's funny because the audiences usually get older with the composer, but they didn't in my case. And I was talking to the players. They said, you know, we've got this music. There's 40 years of music of the ensemble. I haven't written music for the ensemble in a while now. But I said, you know, I think maybe we should go on playing it because I said, well, it can be like the Duke Ellington band. We'll play my hits.
That's right.
You know,
exactly.
And I said, if we don't play it, who's going to play it?
The music in 12-part story where you put it together part by part and then you finally had the big event and rented town hall.
Yeah.
And it's amazing.
Well,
what a great
what
story.
amazing was that I rented a town hall and we filled the hall.
Exactly.
1,400 seats. I used to play it on the weekends in my studio in the loft in Soho, New York. And about 30 or 40 people would come, piece by piece. And I had this crazy idea when I finished it in '74 that it would have a grand opening, and I put signs all around downtown that we're going to do the complete music in 12 parts, which we'd only played 2 or 3 parts at a time.
And the complete is almost 5 hours.
Yeah,
something,
pretty
4.5.
much 5 hours.
Yeah.
And we sold it out.
Yeah.
And I don't know where where did these people come from?
Yeah.
But then that was in '74. No, that was in '76. We were at the Metropolitan Opera House.
Right.
With Einstein on the Beach and that song. Now, the funny thing was that we shouldn't have had an audience, right? Well, I mean,
Why not?
I wasn't connected to anything. I had no musical academy that I was part of at the time, or I didn't teach anywhere. We're just like these people downtown writing this crazy music, and somehow we ended up at the Met. I don't really know.
Yeah.
It's one of those strange accidents.
I think it's fantastic. Do you want to hear a smidge of music in 12 parts or not particularly?
No, why don't you play the piece from...
Yeah, when we'll get to that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
the other ones. So, because we were talking.
Which part do you want to play from 12 parts?
Oh, I was going to play the 12th part.
Oh yeah, well that's a very funny part.
Let's just hear. Let's hear a little bit.
If you listen to the whole thing, you would actually hear the whole thing. You would hear it that way.
Well, it's so interesting when you make the shifts, when you make a
Yeah,
change.
the shifts was important. And it was really about paying attention to music in a way, paying attention at all. Paying attention at all is kind of an achievement. We very rarely are able to do that. But I call it the flow of attention. The flow of attention is, it's like the flow of eternity. Mm-hmm. It's something that is not noticeable, but is once that becomes part of the process, the whole idea of content begins to change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems that the decision of when to make a change can either be intuitive or you can work it out mathematically, and of course this has evolved over time.
Willing to sit through it. Mm-hmm. And the surprising thing was that people were. Mm-hmm. And we had audiences very early. That was the last part of Music in 12 Parts. And there were 1,400 people sat for 5 hours and listened to this
fantastic.
Stuff. And we had a good time. You know, we still play that every year.
Yeah.
And now we can actually play it pretty well.
Yeah. You know, it's an enormous stamina that's required. I mean, just in terms of
yes, yeah, that's
fingers.
True. But now that's okay. Then we have to talk about performance practice, because there's a, with every, for every new style of music, there was a performance practice that goes with it. And if that weren't true, then it wouldn't really be new music. Every new music has to have a way of playing at this note. So what we discovered and what we learned how, we learned how to play with a very light touch, and with we learned about breathing. We became, this is the ensemble, we've been together 40 years. We can actually play this music now. We can play for 4 or 5 hours and we aren't even that tired.
It's fantastic.
We stop to eat, but we don't, what's interesting that is there was a performance practice that went with the music, but there's also a listening practice. And that's the other side of it.
Yeah, and with Einstein being revived many times, people now know how to listen to it in a certain way that
well, no, people listen to Einstein now and they think we wrote it last week. Well, I wrote it. It sounds like it was. It's interesting that what's curious to me. You see, I was surprised when there was an audience for this music, and at the beginning there were 30, 40 people, and then 100 people, 200 people, and then there started to be rooms full of people. Frankly, I was prepared to write that music for the rest of my life and not have very many. I didn't expect to have big audiences. Eventually, I did some Hollywood movies, and that was interesting, and that helped to make a larger audience, actually.
Yeah.
But and the idea never actually was to find a new audience, though I did find one. Because I found a new way of playing, but I found also a new way of listening. Now, that's, without the listeners, what are we doing? So I needed that. I didn't realize how important that audience was, but I was basically making an audience at the same time that I was making a music.
Yeah.
Isn't that, and now, when we talk about contemporary music, there's ways of listening. I think it helped people listen to John Cage, so John never thought so. John thought it was kind of, he always said, Philip, too many notes, too many notes.
Yeah, exactly.
And you know what I said? John, I'm one of your children, whether you like it or not. But in a way, I felt that in a way, if you could listen to music in 12 parts, then you can listen to 4 minutes and 30 seconds of silence. I really felt that I was connected to him, though he didn't. It's funny, I think he liked me. I know we liked each other, but he really didn't get the music at all, though he liked Satyagraha. In fact, he came to see it twice.
Fantastic. So with Einstein, I just wanted to point out that Philip's written more operas than anyone I can imagine, and I'm already I have so many more questions to ask you. I'm going to jump through this, but more than Henze, more than Britten, and the whole Einstein phenomenon is incredible. And I just wanted to ask, what for you makes an excellent collaboration? I mean, you've worked with dancers, choreographers, filmmakers.
In fact, the elements of theater, we have movement, text, image, and music. Those are the 4. It's like air, earth, fire, and water. Those are the 4 elements of opera. There's the same 4 elements in film. To me, the collaboration is when all those things come into play. That really only happens with opera and film. And so I've done a lot of films, I've done a lot of operas. With dance, you have image and movement and music, but you don't have text necessarily. You might have text, but rarely do you have text. A play will have words and music. I'm doing music for the Crucible now. That's being done on Broadway, and so that's music with words, and there is movement, and there's image also. Well, this comes very close to it because this particular director wanted music, and I provided the music for it.
Yeah.
But to me, what I tried to do was to put a team of, I would have to have at least those 4 people. And then besides that, you want a lighting designer and a costume designer. So you end up with 6 people, 7 people. Sound designer as well. That makes it 7. But the other thing I did, which was an unusual thing, Einstein was a very big success, and I simply didn't want to work with anyone again for a while. I did another piece with Bob 8 years later, and over the next 35 years, we've done 5 or 6 operas.
And that brings me to, I really wanted to talk about Monsters of Grace. I love that.
But that was a third or fourth collaboration I did with him.
Exactly, and I'd love to play an example if I could.
Yeah.
It is so beautiful. But do you want to just tell a little tiny bit about what the piece is?
About the what?
About Monsters of Grace, the Rumi, or the 3D, and then we're going to play a little bit of track 9.
It was a piece about, it was supposed to be what Bob really wanted to do. He wanted to do a piece which we really needed to do with computers, that where the changes of the images were so slow, but we couldn't, and that the changes of colors could be.
Yeah.
I could do that in the music, and technically he could do it later on, but at the time it was very difficult to do. Bob is a master of slow.
I know.
I mean, here's how he would. I did a lot of auditions with Bob. A Bob Wilson audition is, we're sitting in chairs, and he says, walk across the stage, slow. He said, take 5 minutes to walk across. That's a long time. Very few people could do it. If you could get across, if you could make it across the stage in 5 minutes, there's a chance he would use you.
Okay.
But that was his,
Yeah.
that's how he did it. I presented the idea of Rumi. Rumi was a 12th century poet, a Persian poet.
Coleman Barks
did some beautiful translations. Now, to translate from a language which is that far away from a European based language, you have to be a poet also. And he was able to make poetry out of the translations, and they're beautiful.
Yeah, they're
poems.
beautiful.
These, if you don't know Rumi, they seem extreme. This poetry is 800 years old. It sounds like it was written yesterday.
It totally does. And
Bob did the images for it, and we traveled with it. We did a tour with it, but Bob could never he couldn't slow the images down as much as he wanted to, and he found it very frustrating.
Well, I love the piece, and we'll hear a little tiny bit of it, and then I have one final question for you before we open up for other people's questions. So this is the track called Let the Letter Read You, and I picked the version where Tara Hugo is singing.
Yes.
It's gorgeous.
Yes, beautiful singer.
It's absolutely beautiful, and of course this is more recent Philip Glass than some of the other tracks that we've heard.
Why stay so long where your words are scattered and doing no good? I've sent a letter a day for 100 days. Either you don't read the mail, or you've forgotten how to leave.
Hate to turn any of these examples off. And I have like probably 100 more questions that I'd love to ask you, but I'm just going to close with one question, and you don't have to answer it. No, you can just avoid the question if you'd like to. So you described yourself as a Jewish, Taoist, Hindu, Toltec Buddhist. And I wanted to.
Is that a good enough list?
Yeah, that's a great list. But I did really seriously want to ask.
A few important things. Go ahead.
I mean, you're such a generous and deep and rich human being, and that's very much felt. I mean, we just did a fantastic class with all my composers, and I mean, you were so beautiful in that class. Anyway, I wanted to ask, what are your own religious or spiritual interests and beliefs, and how have they evolved?
See, it takes that. To me, that we talk about the mind and the body, which we know about that. But there's the mind and the body and the spirit, which we don't know so much about. And besides, I got interested in music, but I also, along the way, I met my first yoga teacher when I was 20. That was in 1957. I couldn't even, a friend of mine and I, we were 20 years old, we were living in New York. We had heard about yoga, we didn't know what it was, and we decided to find a teacher. We couldn't find anyone. There was no one teaching. So we looked under Y in the phone book. And there was a guy named Yogi Vitaldis. We called him up. Now, it turned out to be Yehudi Menuhin's teacher.
Oh, is that right?
I didn't know that at the time. We went up to see him, and he gave us our first lesson. And then after the lesson, he said, no, he took mostly he was doing exercises for Upper East Side ladies, to be truthful. That's what he did. And when we walked into the room, and we had called him and said, we wanted to take a lesson with him. We walked and he said, my chelas have finally arrived. Chela means students. Here's my students have finally arrived. That was Michelle and I. And after the lesson, he said, okay, now we're going to the kitchen. He said, now I'm going to teach you about how to cook vegetarian food. And I became so not only did I begin studying yoga with him, I became a vegetarian when I was 20. And that was almost 60 years ago. And I stayed a vegetarian, and I kept the practice, different ones over the years. But what I discovered from him, and then when I was talking with Ravi Shankar, let me just say one, and then maybe this will help just what I wanted to say. At one point, in the book we talk about, I wanted to know where music came from, and a lot of that book is I would ask people.
Music's a place.
One day I was sitting with Ravi Shankar in his hotel room in London. He had done some concerts, and I was living in Paris, and I came over to see him. I'd already been working with him for a while. And he was sitting on the bed cross-legged, and I was sitting on the chair. And he said, Ravi, tell me something. Where did your music come from? And he said, and he turned to a table up by his bed, and on the table was a photograph of an Indian gentleman in an Indian dress, and he turned and he made a full bow to the picture. He said, thanks to the grace of the Guru, the music has come to me through him. I said, oh my. So that was, what a revelation that was. And yet, then I began to think about it, and I thought, well, that's how it came to me. It came then in some traditions they call it the ear-whispered teachings. And this is such an important thing. And people say, well, is it just in India or Tibet that these things? No, we have teachers. I had a flute teacher and I learned everything about the flute from him. You've had a dance teacher, or you've had someone who taught you how to cook, or someone that, it's always that way. The lineage is always ear-whispered. There are classes, of course, we have those. But the best classes are the ones where you are alone with the teacher. Isn't it?
One-on-one.
So I began to cultivate these meetings. And I found a Taoist teacher who taught Qigong and Tai Chi. I found teachers in India and Tibet, teachers in Mexico who were Toltec teachers, people who don't even speak the language, that we don't even have a language. That I began working with musicians that we don't even have a language that we speak together. But the point is that, and this is that the most precious transmissions happen from someone, the teacher giving it to the student. And it happens it's not exclusively Asian or African, or it's American and it's European. It happens, it's a human transmission. It's not confined to a tradition. So that, in a way, when I listed things, I was just trying to create the idea that, of course, it can be maybe you're doing the Talmud with a rabbi, or maybe your teacher is a Quaker, or maybe it's a Buddhist, or maybe it's someone in Mexico who's talking about fire and space. But what I wanted to capture in that idea was that the transmission of this wisdom, it happens that way. And part of it is carried in the music, and part of it can be carried in food, it can be carried in clothing, it can be carried in poetry, it can be carried in something as simple and important as ethics, and do I dare say morality? That's how those things are truly communicated. And that whole, when I list that thing, it's a shorthand for this whole little discussion that we made. I'm happy you asked me, because I don't want to get a chance to talk about it very much, but in one tradition that I know, I asked someone what they meant by morality, and they said, oh, morality means keeping your commitments. I said, oh, that's very interesting. Maybe that is what it is. I never thought of it that way. And since then, when people talk about it, I think about it that way now. So, and ethics, I mean, okay, these great judges come and they go, but ethics is something, it's simpler than that. Ethics is close to manners. And manners are close to the way humanity has a way of greeting each other. The way we greet each other, or we greet our children, or we greet our husbands or our wives and our teachers. These are the most precious things. And as we're composers and we're musicians, so for us it comes in that way. But it's not exclusively to artists at all.
Yeah.
The wisdom of humanity comes about that way, and it comes about in a simple way. The man that teaches you, or the woman that teaches you how to put your shoes on. I mean, what an incredible thing to do.
Yeah.
Did you ever have to teach your children to tie their shoelaces?
Yeah.
It's a little hard at first, isn't it?
So, I mean, that's just so gracious, really everything you've said. And I know that there are some people waiting at microphones, I think, to ask you some questions. We certainly have them here.
We're not done.
Sorry, we're not done.
That's okay.
If there are no questions, I'll pop out a few more, but I'm hoping we have some. And the microphone is coming, and there's one down here, I notice.
In the late 70s, you scored a documentary called North Star, and I was curious, at that point in your career, you had been used to composing pieces 15, 20 minutes. How did you find the experience of having to create very short cues and convey a musical statement within each of them?
That was a request. I began doing movies, and that was a movie actually. And North Star was the name of a sculpture that was done. I did the music for, and you know, I had never done a film before, and I thought that was I just wanted to do it. I learned a lot from doing it. I learned about what the limitations were, but you know, I ended up doing a lot of films. Some. Like the one Mishima that was here the other night, some of you may have seen it, was one of the most extraordinary films I ever worked on with a great designer, Eiko Ishioko, and Mishima, the writer. Again, I said all the elements are there. You know, it's funny. There are in the music world, there are strict lines of behavior, I can say, that change from working in film, working with dance, working with opera, it's all different. The workplaces are controlled by the person who makes the decisions about what's going to happen. It's very easy to see how this happens. If you're working in a film, the film producer actually tells the director what's going to happen. If you're working in the theater, it's the theater director. If you're working with a choreographer, I remember I was doing a ballet with Jerry Robbins years ago called we called it Glass Pieces. I wanted to see it at the rehearsal, and the orchestra sounded terrible. I said, Jerry, we've got to do something with the orchestra. He said, look, I got an hour left from my rehearsals where the opening is tonight. Get out of here. And the orchestra finally, it took him a year to learn to play the music, and it was a painful year for me. But there was no question. The time was going to be determined by Jerry Rogers decided what was going to do. So that each of these workplaces is controlled, and it's done. These workplaces are. It's defined by who makes the decision about what's going to happen. The only place, the best place for the composer is the opera house. There you pick the writer, the director, the designer. The opera house is the composer's house.
The singers.
That's why I wrote so many operas. I got left alone. I got to be the guy that decided, the decider, as Bush used to say. I was the decider.
Right. There's time for a couple of more questions. I'm not sure who has the microphones.
I have one here. Your music for The Hours expanded the beauty and sensitivity and meaningfulness of that film so deeply and greatly, and I wonder if you could comment on the process of your collaboration for that film, and then also with choreographers, if you could say something, please, about that kind of collaboration.
If you have, the film is about, there are 3 stories that go together, and the film is it's an A story, a B story, and a C story. One story takes place in Hollywood in the 30s, another one in New York in the 50s. What's the third? I forget. But and the difficulty of the film was to find a score that would fit everything. And I was hired. I was asked to write the music, and I found out right away that 2 other composers had already been fired, so I was the 3rd one. So I knew that I had a chance. That I would do the first. Well, we did movies in terms of reels. So the first reel, I did the first reel. If I didn't get it through the first reel, I was going to lose the job. So I did that. I wrote the first reel in about 5 or 6 days. And what I did is I found a thematic idea for each of the stories. And the movie is made ABC, 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 the 3 stories, and the music goes that way. And I used the music to pull it together. It was as if I had pulled it together with ropes to make it one story, because my feeling with when I saw the film, it was like, there was a force that was like a centrifugal force that was throwing it out, that was making it fall apart. And I had to find a force that would bring it back together. So I pulled it together with the music. And so I invited the producer to come back. He came back with 4 people. They sat in a row in the studio, and the people that worked for me were in another room, and I'm going in, and I'm going there and sit with them. They watch the movie, the first reel, and finally, Scott Rudin was the producer. There's a total silence. No one says anything. Finally, he says, "Well, finally, there's some music I can listen to while I watch the movie." I said, "Thank you." I walked out and said, "We got the job."
Oh, that's great. Great. Is someone walking around with mics? Yeah, there we go.
Thank you. This is a very personal question. For the last 6 years, I've suffered from a very crippling writer's block. And as an academic, it's not something that I oftentimes admit. But you have had periods in your creative life where you have had some pretty severe haters. People, I've even heard stories coming up on stage and trying to stop you from playing the pieces that you have composed. And I'm so inspired by what you have done in terms of a creative body of work. How have you, as a creator, gotten through those moments when the entire world seems to be telling you, even in your own head, to just shut up and stop?
Well, there are 2 issues here. The thing about the writer's block and the haters circle, they're not exactly the same thing, but the haters are easy because I just ignore them.
Yeah, one thing you said is that you have the quote, "I don't care what you think" gene.
I really had that big time. I didn't really care if they liked it or not. And look, I never thought I was going to be a great, successful composer anyway, so the whole thing has been a surprise from day one till now. I was writing music for people in lofts downtown in New York, and they came and put a few dollars in a hat at the end of the concert, and that was what I thought that was it. I had day jobs, and I had a day job until I was 42. You know, and I was prepared to go on for a long time. I didn't care about that. That I can't help you with. The writer's block, now here's the thing, we were talking about this earlier in the day. The thing about music is that if a composer doesn't, Rachmaninoff had a writer's block. He evidently found a psychoanalyst and got over it. The first thing he wrote after his writer's block was Concerto No. 2, which is his big famous piece. And then he wrote Symphony No. 3, and he wrote a lot of stuff. But he was very young when he wrote Symphony No. 1, and what happened was that he couldn't, it was a big success, and he couldn't make that next piece. That's unusual. Usually, composers, instead of having writer's block, if they begin playing the piano, they begin singing, they do something. If you go, what I would do if I didn't have any ideas, that wouldn't bother me very much. I would just start to play the piano, and then I would start to make up stuff. And before I knew it, I was doing something. It's harder for people, painters and writers have a different process. Painters have the empty canvas problem, and writers have the empty page problem. Dancers and musicians and poets, by the way, poets don't have that problem. They just pick up scraps of everyday language and they begin to work with it. Maybe there's a way that if you look at your colleagues, and we're not that different, it's just that the materials that we use are more available to us. If the materials were more available to you, for example, if a poet could just speak his poetry, it would probably make it easier. But mostly, poets don't have that problem so much. It really is a painters and writers problem. And we don't have it exactly, except I'm suggesting that the activity of music itself can break the musical problem. And maybe it must be the activity of writing that somehow, the solution will be somewhere there, I would guess.
I noticed that we do have to stop. I wanted to say two things. First of all, we really want you to come back as soon as possible. Because
Thank you.
there are so many more questions to ask, and we're so fortunate to have you here. You're always welcome back, and we're going to try to get you back. But I did want to say, in a master class that you gave, there was a student who said that he had written some music, but that he didn't know what to do with it. And he came to you and he said, well, what should I do with this music? And you said, well, I know the feeling. It's like walking into a restaurant, but all the tables are taken. So what do? This is you saying, you build another table. Just build your own table, quote unquote. And so I'm just thanking you for building your own tables for all these years.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.